Disclaimer. This video uses AI voiceover due to the sensitivity of the topic discussed. Due to my previous video, this 5-hour video by JasperDasper was brought to my attention, and it seems to have remarkably high praise from the transgender community. I have decided that the video is worth a deeper look. I wanted to see if there are good points in it that counter my video or conflict with my findings. I'm always open to discussing counter-evidence. So why not? Who is JasperDasper?
This video has taken up my day, every day, for the last 2 years. It has taken up my weekends. It has made me drop out of university. I dropped out after 3 semesters in business.
As far as I can tell, a YouTuber and a college dropout who is really passionate about this topic and claims to have spent 2 years researching it. My immediate concern is that a college dropout might be much too unfamiliar with research methodology, and thus his sources may be heavily biased, non-peer reviewed, and ideologically charged. Let's see if that's true. So I will look at this video in segments. First chapter. Definitions. This covers roughly the first 48 minutes of the video. First, he says,
You could read through all her sources, through the decades of research, court documents, counter-arguments, sociological and scientific advancements, political movements, leaks, corruption, and motives. You could do that. Or, you could just listen to trans people.
Trans people are very likely mentally ill, which is the claim you're supposed to debunk in the first place. He brought this up several times in just this opening section.
What actually makes someone trans? Well, I don't know. I don't know. Don't look at me. Listen to trans people.
Okay, so let's listen to Blair White.
I have just thoughts about mental illness that it's not necessarily to be stigmatized. So like when I say it, I'm not trying to put myself down in the same way that if I was up here saying I have really bad social anxiety or I have, depression, gender dysphoria is a mental illness. I just think it boils down to if you think being mentally ill is something to be, feeling bad about.
Or do we listen to Scott Nugent?
My name's Scott Nugent. I'm a lesbian and I'm a trans man. I underwent close to $1 million worth of surgeries and hormone therapies to change from Kelly to Scott, a trans man. And then I almost died in the process. And I certainly have cut many, many years off of my life. In fact, I probably won't live long enough to meet my grandkids because I still, to this day, get recurring infections. Nobody knows why. But again, 95% of all medical transition is experimental, except for top surgery. I was tricked at 42, at a vulnerable place. One day I thought, God, maybe I'm born in the wrong body. I was married to a woman who just despised being a lesbian. And one comment of maybe I was born in the wrong body. Next week, I was sitting in front of a trans woman therapist who asked me, how long have you been dressing like a man? At 42, that sentence has changed the trajectory of my life. You guys don't seem to understand that I'm not going to meet my grandkids. And yet you call him a bigot. And you don't talk to me. You show all of the people, trans women are women. We need to let children have the time to learn to love their natural bodies.
Or any of these detransitioners.
I'm a detransitioner. In high school, I thought that I was trans male. It turned out that I was not. I just wish I could tell myself, please don't do this because now my biggest dream in life is to have a kid and I don't even know if I'm going to be able to do that.
Oh, but those are not the correct trans people, right? They don't agree with the narrative. Their opinions don't count. You have to pick exactly the right ones to listen to. Jasper, how about we do look at all that other data you mentioned? Or does the data also have to be from only specific people? Oh, of course.
You could read through all her sources. Or, you could just listen to trans people.
The problem here is obvious. The argument is to ignore science and listen to a random person who may be mentally ill, mistaken, misunderstanding, or indoctrinated into an ideology. Very poor scientific basis.
All my sources are linked right here. and in a separate document in the description.
Going through all of his sources up to now, it's all blog posts, opinion pieces, Q&I posts, from heavily trans-biased sources, by the way. And so far, there hasn't been even one academic paper to support his claims. With all those sources, he fails to provide a source for the main questions.
What it means to be a man and a woman shifts throughout time and culture. And exactly because it shifts, because we have the power to influence these shifts, and because the ideals themselves are contradictory, incongruent, and impossible, we see gender as separate from sex.
Not one society in all of human history had reversed or significantly altered gender roles. That's anthropological consensus. I would really love to see his source, but he doesn't provide one.
Now, Joyce has the courtesy of actually naming these few wealthy people who she accuses of having shaped the global agenda. Jennifer Pritzker, John Stryker, Martin Rothblatt, and George Soros.
Soros' contributions to the cause are quite well documented, and he's open about his support, regardless of whether you follow a Jewish conspiracy or not.
Joyce is just a mathematician. I just want to remind you that Helen Joyce is a mathematician.
And what are you? As far as I understood, Jasper is a college dropout who gained 1 subscriber, took a break, became an alcoholic, and then dropped out of university to make this video. What exactly makes him qualified on anything? At least Joyce has a PhD in something and is thus familiar with research methodology. He is clearly not, which is going to be a significant advantage, even if her field of expertise is not on this topic. Research skills transfer over to other fields. Lastly, his section on intersex is also ideologically charged. Here is a picture of intersex people, and I think most people would have no trouble categorizing these individuals into the correct gender. Why is that? As we established in my previous video, having one mutation doesn't change your gender. It's not defined by one single thing. For example, this person. Facial hair, body hair, masculine stature, balding head, those are all features of men. This person is clearly a male who maybe happens to have a chromosomal mutation. Even in the totally confusing cases, it's still clear from other bodily characteristics what gender the person is from other features. And even if we ignore all of that and assume the validity of Jasper's argument, intersex people are their own category, and it doesn't make the doctor wrong to call babies a certain sex based on their genitals, because in well over 99% of cases, he will still be correct. And if he examines anything other than genitals, he will still be able to correctly determine the gender with perfect accuracy. This isn't difficult. Chapter 2. Debunking begins in the first part. He debunks this one singular paper on rapid onset gender dysphoria by Lisa Littman. I have to say the arguments he presents against this paper are actually very valid, and the research setup was indeed heavily biased. I think we agree on disqualifying this study as a credible reference. However, one of the biggest authors for the alternative is Jack Turbin, who, as I described in my previous video, has massive conflict of interest and was paid by a puberty blocker manufacturer to produce the studies he did. And his work has numerous scientific issues as well. Jasper does not seem to be aware of this, as he quotes Jack Turbin continuously throughout the video, but disregards Lisa Littman's study that carries the same scientific problems. So, are there any non-biased studies that looked into ROGD?
Okay, I hear you say, but that one pilot study might be bad, but aren't there any other good studies on ROGD? No, there aren't.
Exactly, there aren't. Thus, it's true that we can't scientifically claim that there is a social contagion. However, we also can't claim that we proved its absence. We simply don't know, we haven't studied it properly. A lack of research does not equal point disproven. Non-biased people simply haven't tackled the problem. However, I would put forward the argument that we do know it's possible to make somebody believe something that isn't true. Manipulators are great at doing that. Brainwashing is a thing. Psychological suggestion is a thing. Of course, it doesn't happen overnight either, but for example, imagine a man who happens to like makeup. In one scenario, he gets told he is a man who simply likes makeup, and he continues his life normally. In another scenario, he has 5 friends who immediately bombard him with questions. Did you think about being trans? He opens the internet, watches TV, and sees ideological propaganda that makes him think there is something deeper there than expected. We use psychological suggestion all the time. Commercials play on tricking your mind into thinking you need that beauty product they show you in the ad. The whole argument of gender ideology is that gender roles are socially constructed. So if I can socially construct a gender and its roles for you, can't I also socially construct your alternative gender identity? So either gender is not a social construct or you have a social contagion. These things cancel each other out logically. But I digress. This specific topic is not properly researched in literature, so no point in dwelling on this too much. The comparison with left-handedness is a glaring false equivalence fallacy. Really quickly, I do have an issue with Jasper taking time to think as some sort of an anti-trans Bible. Personally, I have never read the book nor heard of it. My opinions are based on evidence from research, not opinion pieces from random, unqualified authors. The autism argument I frankly heard for the first time in my life. I was aware trans people have higher rates of autism, but it has never been my conclusion from the research that autism exclusively causes gender dysphoria. Frankly, that is a ridiculous conclusion to me from the data. But it is true that trans people disproportionately suffer from many mental issues, such as anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, trauma, and so forth. The percentages are high in all cases, and there are always a majority of those without the specific mental issue, of course. But is it always the same 20% that have all the mental issues? Or could it be that mental issues are spread across the trans population, and the vast majority have an underlying condition, such as autism, depression, and so forth, that could be related to the development of gender dysphoria? Jasper does not delve into this idea nor prove or disprove it, and I think that is misrepresenting the argument and assuming his own conclusions from this one book he happened to pick up. And this is necessary because that is the scientific method. You must eliminate other factors before you can say something is surely gender dysphoria. And you need to remove all further variables to confirm it's a real state and not a distortion of perception such as schizophrenia or psychosis or apopnophilia. He hyperfocuses on autism when the scientific argument to make is that most trans people will likely have some underlying mental condition, autism being used as merely an example. In the next segment, Jasper attempts to prove that trans people have always existed. This is, I believe, the third strawman of the anti-trans arguments in this video. It may not be a strawman of some conspiracy nuts or the source book. I don't know, I haven't read it, because it seems heavily biased, but it is a strawman of any reasonable anti-trans spokesman. Trans people exist. And gender dysphoria is a real condition. But the argument is that there should be better methods to tackle it without irreversible body transformation and risky procedures. As I outlined in my last video, we need to help these people live a normal life and accept themselves as they are, not deny they exist. And just to show that this is the real argument of the anti-trans crowd, here's a clip of Charlie Kirk summing it up.
Transgender male, what age should kids be able to get things like hormone therapy? Because I don't know what's true, what's not.
Tell me, are you comfortable telling me your story?
I've known that since like 3rd grade, and I'm currently 19, almost 20. I just don't know, like, with the whole medical stuff, like what's true, what's not, what's helpful, because I've heard so many different opinions.
First of all, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, of course.
So I'm going to have an opinion that very few people will ever tell you, which is I want you to be very cautious putting drugs into your system in the pursuit of changing your body. I instead encourage you to work on what's going on in your brain first. I think what you need first and foremost is just a diagnosis. Just someone that is going to listen to what you've gone through, listen to what else is going on. My prayer for you, and again, very few people will say this, I actually want to see you be comfortable in how you were born.
Yeah.
I know that you might not feel that way, but I think that is something that you can achieve. I think that with the right team and the right people, you don't have to wage war on your body. You can learn to love your body.
Basically, Jasper is not even arguing the correct argument. I have frankly never heard half of these arguments in the scientific sphere. I think what Jasper is doing is like taking someone who believes that vegans needing to take vitamin B12 means that we must have a little meat in our diet, and representing them with an extreme carnivore dieter who claims oranges are toxic. On puberty blockers, there is a way to use them safely, although they do still have plenty of side effects, but the question is more about whether you should. If you are giving them to someone with an underlying mental health condition that is making the patient experience gender dysphoria, you will be tackling the wrong problem. If you are giving them to a young child who cannot properly consent, that is also not okay. We need to be absolutely sure such a young person can consent, which is actually well summarized in the clip Jasper uses.
To call a child transgender is to make both a claim that the child's feelings represent material reality and an assumption about that child's future. They will not change.
This is valid. Just like with other mental issues, or even everyday life where you misunderstand events or what someone said, feelings do not reflect reality by default. Children also lack the long-term vision and knowledge to really determine whether this is a temporary state. I think this claim is quite valid. In literature, studies also frequently call for such assessments, even if they generally support puberty blockers. The studies themselves are numerous, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go one by one, but with a couple blanket observations. As I showed already in my last video, most studies look at effects on mental health only a short time after transition or therapy. Long-term studies more consistently find mixed or negative results. Higher-level reviews also emphasize low certainty and robust long-term trials. Additionally, if we take Jack Turbin's studies as an example, there are things such as allowing the same person to take the survey multiple times. Questions were confusing, biased sampling and unacknowledged natural exclusions, and also false reporting based on their own criteria. Similar issues plague a lot of the studies, and while it is true that plenty of studies support puberty blockers, they are not thoroughly researched enough, and conflicts of interest are inadequately verified to already accept puberty blockers as the norm. Also, they do have side effects. Jasper is correct in pointing out that causality with tumors has not been established, and sexuality changes are more connected to cross-sex hormones. However, it is also true that the vast majority of kids on puberty blockers also receive hormone therapy, which means that regardless of which procedure actually causes sexual changes, children put on gender-affirming care will likely experience sexual and reproductive harm. Again, most studies ask participants a short time after treatment, after which most of them report being satisfied and happier. Fair. But are we taking into account that maybe when these teenagers are in their 30s, they may want kids and can't have them anymore, and so their outlook on their treatment might change? Data on long-term effects also remains quite scarce, which further promotes caution. All in all, I think the main argument against puberty blockers isn't to fight back and forth about which side effects are acceptable and which aren't, but rather that a hypothetical therapy that doesn't change your body, but rather allows you to accept yourself in your natural body, would not only be a far safer approach, but also one that would allow trans individuals to live the most normal life with the least mental problems. We may not yet know what that therapy may be exactly, but the focus should be on that. Funny, that sounds like Kenneth Zucker's point as well. A therapy that makes trans people comfortable in their own skin without the need to change the body. And I think that's the main disagreement between me and Jasper. Jasper's entire video hinges on the idea that conversion therapy is inherently bad, whereas I argue it is the optimal treatment method, if only we can find the most effective procedure that doesn't require any collateral damage to either the patient's psyche or body autonomy. Jasper misrepresents the argument here as some malicious attempt at eliminating trans people and designing gender norms for them or straight up denying their existence. But in reality, Zucker's argument is really just a logical assessment of the literature and subsequent promotion of the pursuit for the optimal treatment method. He determined that sex reassignment wasn't the way to go, which is the same conclusion I arrive to when I look at the literature, and he focused his efforts into finding a way to treat the delusion. He doesn't deny trans people exist, but that trans people have a treatable mental condition. He isn't neglecting understanding why trans people feel the way they feel. Researching therapy methods, actually, is about understanding why trans people feel the way they do and treating it to help them live a normal life. As for the supposedly so messed up study on kids, the study looked like this. Do you think this girl is cute, beautiful, or pretty? Would you be able to rate her on a scale? Congratulations, you just participated in the study. Can you see how making this in any way a sexual thing is if you yourself look at kids that way? I hope you do. At least I think you can call a child pretty without it having a sexual connotation. Also, parents were notified and gave consent. Nobody said anything to the kids directly, and nobody was traumatized in the study. A lot of this cannot be said for the pro-trans pioneers. Should we delve into Alfred Kinsey's research into 5-month-olds' orgasms? Do we need to talk about John Money again?
I believe that Zucker believes that psychiatry is a pure science with certain factually right and wrong answers. If there's a problem, there must also be a root to that problem, and if we haven't found it, it's just because we haven't dug deep enough. A person is made up of pure genetics and decisions, an ultra-rational individual organism. And to that I say, maybe take a single course in sociology like I did.
A single sociology course makes you more qualified than 50 years of experience in the field. How about you take a social psychology course to learn about how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by others? The point is that it's not so simple that, quote, a single sociology course could debunk it. The status of psychology as a science is actually debated. Once again, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just like in chemistry, you can mix two things and get different products under different conditions. You can have a child whose dad is an alcoholic, and that makes him either an alcoholic too or totally sober under certain conditions we need to figure out. The effect of the environment is really the same as the reaction conditions in chemistry, which is a pure science. Not having mapped every influence yet doesn't mean psychology is necessarily not a pure science. We don't know why certain things happen in chemistry either, but we don't call it random chance. Anyway, moving on. In terms of persistence of gender dysphoria,
the first source was from England's National Health Service, which relies heavily on old studies. Studies in which the children are coerced, ridiculed, and beaten into viewing their experience as a delusion.
I will just say I wasn't able to find this in the studies Jasper highlights on screen. If children were beaten or coerced into anything, I'd like to see where it says so. Those are quite serious accusations. At least from what I could find, there was nothing questionable in these studies to me. The children were simply treated and studied as anyone else with any other mental issue. But correct me if I'm wrong.
That's wrong, because the source that Barnes links to is not the actual critique, but instead a reply to the critique. And can you guess who wrote the reply? Yeah, it's Kenneth Zucker, of course it is.
So when it comes to desistance rates, I have two options. I can either argue why or how the desistance studies are valid and the methods make sense and start that debate. Or I skip that and humor Jasper, assume he is completely correct and ignore any studies that rely on the data from those big studies, and ignore biased studies from the other side like Jack Turbin. only to then once again arrive to an absence of evidence situation. This is an argument Jasper can't seem to win, so I'm not sure if I should even waste my breath. Taking Jasper's arguments as true ends up consistently concluding that we don't even know the little we think we know. Honestly, such massive lack of non-biased studies is a better argument to halt the gender ideology than Zucker could ever hope to produce. That said, I fully support his case against recurs. The physical punishments were absolutely too severe, and thus, even if they were effective, are also not a valid treatment method by any stretch. It is, however, false that this particular study was used as a base for DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, as even if it would be cited, nothing in this study is about diagnosis, it's about treatment. Out of all the most cited and relevant, accepted studies, none of them are actually from recurs. And the only one by Zucker, which Jasper cites 13 times in this video, was rigorously reviewed by other papers that are more relevant for the diagnostic criteria. It wasn't just straight up accepted without review, as Jasper may imply. Additionally, the physical punishment in the said study happened at home, by the father, not recurs. Thus, it is entirely possible that the punishment was more severe than recurs prescribed, and he did not know about its severity. These are just hypotheticals, though. There isn't enough verifiable information to confirm. Jasper brings up several studies in the next section, primarily claiming that children whose parents affirm their gender identity experience less psychological distress. However, those studies have glaring problems. First of all, they affirm the current status. It doesn't investigate how much these kids actually thrive long-term. Secondly, of course, affirmation reduced psychological stress. You could apply this to any condition. If you are psychotic, other people participating in your delusion that birds are spying on you will reduce psychological stress. If you have anorexia, everyone praising you for how skinny you are will also reduce distress. But it doesn't mean you're addressing the problem. You're only participating in a delusional world of the patient who may be harming themselves, so I would take these studies with a grain of salt. What follows are anecdotes, and so I guess it's fair I throw in my own personal anecdote then. Content warning: the story is graphic, and you can skip to this time if you are sensitive. I will protect the privacy of the individual in question, so I'll avoid the name. This is a friend of mine who was sold as a child prostitute by her mother. Facing horrendous abuse at the hands of men who paid to rape her as a 6-year-old girl, she ran away from home before she even reached puberty. The abuse left deep and intense scars on her mental health and also left physical health issues that she struggles with to this day. She had a group of LGBT friends who encouraged her to identify as lesbian because due to trauma, she couldn't handle a man's touch. She identified as lesbian and adopted a queer identity. Her psychologists were basically just monitoring her and affirming her identity as a way to process trauma. I was the one to suggest she demands trauma therapy from a different therapist, and after a long time convincing her to try it, she ended up processing her trauma through that doctor with therapy. She thought she was a lesbian until she was 19 years old. Today, she identifies as straight and has a husband. Her identity was intrinsically tied to PTSD. Thus, in my anecdotal example, I have observed ROGD. The gender identity was intrinsically tied to trauma, and conversion therapy via trauma therapy was successful. But I can't blanket apply this to every trans person. I don't know if I can. We simply need more data. So you see, my anecdotal evidence proves ROGD, proves desistance, and disqualifies everything Jasper presents in this video, right? Of course not. Anecdotes are anecdotes. But the utility of them is to show that examples exist on both sides of the argument. It's just really difficult to replicate such states in the lab and really study them, because people's stories are so different and deeply processing each individual like this would take many years. I can agree that studies of ROGD are flawed or the methods questionable, and it makes sense because the subject is incredibly hard to study in a scientific way. But I don't think it invalidates the idea entirely. Trans identity can be a social contagion, and it can be desisted from. But how or why or when is currently not yet understood. Finally, we get to some studies, where Jasper actually finally presents studies and evidence for his point after only 3.5 hours of video. I was really eagerly anticipating this section, so I couldn't wait to dive right in. So let's go one by one. Jack Turbin, with many same flaws as his other studies. Doyle, 2019. This article is paywalled even through my university, so I'm sure you weren't able to actually read it either, which means you don't know the methodology and judging by the ratio of reads to citations. I would guess most scholars didn't take this work seriously. Jetta Zajewski, 2023, only 1-year follow-up. Cass review. Hilary Cass mentions discussions with patients experiencing deep regret, points out lack of any long-term studies very many times throughout the review, and mentions many detransitioners simply may not show up to the clinic. Further, they may choose a different clinic if they detransition. The 10% stat is from the point of discharge and from this specific clinic. It is not from any kind of even short-term follow-up. And would you look at that? Figure 37 from Jasper's own source shows the vast majority detransitioned due to the arguments of anti-trans crowd, and Jasper's cited social pressure and discrimination was only a factor in 13 and 10% of cases. Interesting. It's almost like people who have been psychologists for decades and have handled hundreds of patients know what they're talking about a little better than you. Bustos, 2021. Most studies used had short-term or no follow-ups. There is only one long-term study included, and it's only on 40 patients, and not even all of those have completed reassignment. Some were still on hormones. Some have dropped out of surgery. Many didn't respond even to calls. Which begs the question why, and one patient even died from the complications from sex reassignment. Basically, a majority of the sources are too short-term to mean much. Weepjes, 2018. This is another clinic that maybe has worked for 40 years, but that doesn't mean they did follow-ups for 40 years. In fact, while the range was quite massive, the average patient was clearly still on the low side. Most people didn't opt for follow-ups. C. A common mistake in these studies is assuming that if a person doesn't show up to the clinic anymore, that they are happy. They may not be, but they know there's no point in going back because the procedures are not reversible. Also, the vast majority expressed regret after the median 6 years of follow-up. Very interesting. Could it be they stopped showing up because they started regretting their choice? This is also an important point moving forward. Bruce, 2023, had short follow-up times, despite sounding big, and only dealt with mastectomies exclusively. The Swedish study counted as regret only those who specifically applied for surgery to return to their original gender, and who applied to the same clinic to do so. And again, the average regret period was after 8 years on average, not 1 to 2 years as the vast majority of studies test.
Interestingly, the analysis shows how regret rates become rarer as time goes on. Probably because of better surgical procedures and a more accepting environment. Whereas 4 out of 15 people, that's 27%, had regrets from 1960 to 1970, only 1 out of 360 people had regret from 2000 to 2010.
And for the US Trans Survey, if Jasper had only read literally the next page of his stat, he would have found tons of support for the anti-trans narrative. The vast majority of trans individuals experience congruent mental health issues. The majority of them are struggling. But wait, they reported being happier, I hear you objecting, and I'll get to that. The biggest problem with this report is the inclusion criteria. The survey was open access to anyone who identifies as trans. This already disqualifies anyone who doesn't, so detransitioners. It was only accessible through the UST's website and probably shared on trans forums and websites, which will again be visited by only trans individuals. Do you see the pattern here? I believe this is an unintentional bias, but this survey is not really accessible to those who have abandoned the community, detransitioned or regretted, and wanted nothing to do with this anymore. A lot of the survey is also based on the Cantrell ladder, which is a known faulty research metric. But still, people who transition report being happier. How can this be? Well, with all mental illnesses, if you let people live their delusion, they are happier. If you let apotonophiliacs amputate healthy limbs, they will be happier. If you affirm an anorexic and tell them how great they look at 35 kg, they will be happier. If you participate in someone's delusions that the birds are recording us, they will be happier and more relaxed. If you let a pedophile hang out around a school playground, they will be happier. Who cares what they do if it makes them happier? Just let them. Why should we rid of people's delusions? Let schizophrenics be, let transabled, transracial, apotonophiliacs be, let psychotic people be, let everyone be. If someone wants to be a table, perform surgery to make them look like a table. If someone wants to be a dog, give them hair transplant from a dog so they can look like a dog and be happier in their delusion. Why should we cure anything? Look, at least in short-term surgery seems to help to some degree. And that's great. However, trans people post-surgery still attempt suicide 12x more than the general population and experience mental problems a whole order of magnitude higher than the general population too. This doesn't sound like problem solved and expecting everyone in the world to adopt the same ideas so a person doesn't accidentally get misgendered somewhere is a bit of a tall order, and a lot to expect from a society that is divided on every possible issue. Surgery may be an improvement, but I believe we can do even better. We can minimize the costs, minimize the process, minimize the risks and mental turmoil with a good therapeutic method or medication that makes the trans person happy in their biological body. Or find an area of femininity or masculinity that allows them to express themselves in a way that makes them comfortable. You know, we could argue desistance rates like I have above, but I think a working conversion therapy will always be the superior option because it would carry no risk, no major costs, no raising awareness, no lawmaking, no arguments, no nothing. It is by default better if we can find it. And that's the point of a therapist or a psychology researcher. Otherwise, why even have that as a profession? The last part of Jasper's video is an elaborate ad hominem on everyone opposing gender ideology and is an absolute train wreck. I don't understand how he thought it was okay to leave that in because he shows overwhelming bias in this section, and he tries extremely hard to paint normal behavior and statements as problematic. Think back to the previous example with Zucker's study. Firstly, the account of abuse on Robert Withers was that a trans girl interpreted him sitting with legs open as triggering and straight-up abuse. Really? Does this read as abuse or a person with a mental problem being triggered by normal things? We use this as proof of him being abusive. Hakim's claims are taken way out of proportion. His belief that transgenderism is a mental condition rather than a normal and healthy state of mind is being interpreted as horribly dehumanizing, which is clearly not evident from the text. Once again, Jasper desperately lingers on to the idea that viewing gender dysphoria as a mental condition is inherently dehumanizing and evil, which can only be described as either gross ignorance or deliberate bias. His mere unacceptance of alternative gender identities as observable measures of reality is interpreted as him wanting to sow disrespect, and I genuinely don't see this being the case. I should also mention that works like this aren't written for trans people. They aren't meant to cushion your feelings and gently address a trans person's identity. These are works written for medical professionals in a direct, curious manner. If he wrote a letter directly to a trans person calling them delusional, it wouldn't cure their dysphoria, that's for sure. But for communication between professionals, this is entirely normal. You think you can't find the same things for people discussing schizophrenia, psychosis, and other disorders. You think it's only trans. And of course, completely misrepresenting one person's opinion is seen as a blanket statement on everyone involved with the movement. I also found an interview with Erica Muse, which describes her therapy sessions with Zucker, and they genuinely read like someone interested in the inner workings of gender dysphoria, and not someone trying to be malicious or hurt anyone. He's described as nice and friendly. He eventually did prescribe hormones. The emphasis is on feelings of an event and not what actually happened. The whole story seems a bit overinflated, and the only quote problem was that he didn't immediately affirm her identity and showered her with drugs. Honestly, these sessions sound like scientific practice where you try to figure out different things. Although I will say Zucker hyperfocused on gender dysphoria here and failed to address glaring congruent mental health problems, which Erica seemed to have been able to figure out herself. But either way, this misrepresentation of events, statements, and beliefs, combined with random anecdotes, and the implication that trans activists never work together to push biased narratives, is a pattern throughout this entire last section of the video, and honestly, this should have been completely left out because in the entire 1 hour section, I couldn't find even one accurate point or correctly represented argument. Jasper is completely arguing in bad faith here, showing a lot of bias, and this puts the entire rest of his video into question. Not to mention his web doesn't contain students, newcomers, random people online, or pseudoscientists like himself. No, it contains leading professionals, psychiatrists, experts with decades of therapeutic experience, and somehow he believes his short dive into the literature. Biased sources and anecdotal evidence makes him smarter than all of those academics. I don't want to use an appeal to authority argument, but you're really barking up a tall tree here. This is particularly funny considering he labeled the people who made a similar map of Jewish influence on gender ideology conspiracy theorists. Same method, Jasper. For example, all 4 biggest partners in the U.S. trans survey are primarily funded by Soros or the Rockefellers. Should I apply your logic and suggest that gender ideology is pushed by Jews? I don't think you want to know how many of your pro-trans sources are linked to Soros or other Jews. Hopefully, this example shows how idiotic your approach is to the last part of the video, and how eerily similar you are to the people you so look down on. To end this review, Jasper presents some good points and rightfully attacks some of the more biased studies and bad actors in the anti-trans community, and I'm all for that. Great job. But I think his video had a lot of issues, a lot of arguing in bad faith and plenty of misrepresentation. I really need to underline the absence of evidence fallacy because it is consistent throughout most of Jasper's video. And this is the most important point of my video as well. You cannot claim that something is safe if sufficient research has not been done. And maybe he is right. Maybe in some years' time we have plenty of data that makes me bite my tongue. Maybe we have irrefutable, measured proof that gender identity isn't a delusion, and I'll be happy if that happens. We just currently can't be sure. As my last point, I'd like to stop at the ad hominem fallacy. Disregarding a study because you disagree with some beliefs of the author is a fallacy. I think if a paper by Zucker is scientifically and logically valid, his other beliefs should have no bearing on the validity of the argument. I did not bring this up earlier because I wanted to play by Jasper's rules. I cannot and should not argue in good faith if this isn't reciprocal. If he is going to discredit every study related to Zucker, just because it's related to Zucker, then I will disregard all the studies done by people with a pro-trans bias. And that leads us to absence of evidence. Thus, I think a review of literature needs to be more open-minded and consider nuances in order to have a proper discussion. In truth, while Jasper is correct in pointing out certain flaws, it doesn't blanket invalidate every study done by people in this network. And I was constantly bringing up Jack Turbin intentionally as an example too. He has conflicts of interest, but despite that, I do think some of his papers are perfectly valid sources and they are useful for certain things. I think Jasper's presented studies, even though I critiqued them, are actually useful for certain purposes. I also think that the studies emphasizing affirming care are useful and valid for learning how to talk to trans people, and avoid accidentally triggering them by sitting the wrong way. Likewise, as an example, I used the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing biased source in my first video, but the data was simply collected from a national survey, turned into nice graphs, and if you double-check it, it's perfectly matched, nothing was made up. It just happened to actually support their case. I'm sure not all sources at the Trevor Project are awful, despite it being an extremely biased site. I am aware that critical thinking also involves being able to find truth in a generally biased place. I know to attack the argument, not the person. But this doesn't seem to be the case on the opposite end. Disagreeing with the opinion that gender is or could be a treatable mental condition doesn't make every study published by said person automatically equivalent to a certain German mustache man's book. Avoidance of this fallacy is also partly why I use an AI voiceover. I don't want my identity or unrelated beliefs to influence the perception of my arguments, because that's wrong. Discrediting, devaluing, and dismissing research because of one belief of the author is arguing in bad faith and is an ad hominem fallacy. Trans people are definitely real. Their feelings are real, just like the feelings of patients of any other mental health condition. A depressed person genuinely feels depressed even if everything is okay. An anxious person feels fear even though there is no danger. Feelings are real, but they don't necessarily describe physical reality. I'd like you to see the beauty in physical reality, see the good sides of your sex, and lose the need to escape to a fantasy world to dodge the pain of this one. I want you to feel accepted without having to convince anybody of anything, without the need to spread any awareness. I want you to see yourself in the mirror and think, maybe being a boy or a girl isn't so bad. It's actually kind of nice. I don't have any financial incentives in this. I don't make money or gain anything from trans people going under the knife or not. But I think life is worth living no matter what your biological gender is. You are beautiful the way you are.